In the last section, we spent some time to talk about the goals of our application, including what we want to build and exactly what we want to learn while building it. Now, one of the core aspects of this application is the ability to save and then later retrieve blog posts. In this section, I want to take a little bit of time to talk to you a little bit about exactly how we're going to save these blog posts to some remote API. So, the first thing we'll do is take a look at the general architecture that we're going to use here. When a user visits our page, or when they start up our application, they're going to load up our Redux application, our React and Redux application, into their web browser. The instant that the application loads up inside their browser, we want to show the user a list of blog posts. So, presumably, we're going to have to somehow source or find a list of blog posts to show to the user. To store all these blog posts, we're going to make use of an API that I've already taken the liberty of setting up for this application. So inside of our browser, our React and Redux application will make an AJAX request over to this blog post API, fetch a list of posts, and then show them on the screen to the user. So we've done quite a few applications now where we fetch some amount of data and show it to the user. This is going to be very similar in that regard. So we're going to fetch this list of posts shown to the user. I want to spend a little bit of time inside this section to talk to you more about this blog post API. We're not going to make immediate use of the API. We're not going to use it in the next section or two, but it's going to have a huge impact on how we structure our application. So I want to make sure that you've got at least a preliminary understanding of how the API works. So we're going to check out some documentation. We're going to make a sample request or three and get a better sense of what it's going to do for us. Okay, so let's first pull up the documentation for this API. Inside of my browser, I'm going to manually navigate to reduxblog.herokuapp.com. Now do make sure that you're going to herokuapp.com, not just heroku.com. So do double check that. Okay, on this page, I've set up some amount of documentation that profiles the 4 different routes that you're going to be able to make access to. So you can see every single one of these rows on here is a different route that we can make a request to, and each one has a different purpose. Now the documentation here is, I think somewhat clear, so I just want to do a very brief overview of each of the routes, and if you wish, you can certainly pause the video right now and read through all the documentation yourself. So let's go through each of these 4 routes. The first route that we can make a request to will fetch a list of all the different blog posts that a user has created. The next one will accept a post type request to create a brand new blog post and save it to the server. The third one fetches a very particular post. So you can see in here, the intent is to provide the ID of the post that we're trying to fetch. And then the last one is intended to delete a very particular post. So you're supposed to provide the ID of the post that you want to delete. I want to now try out some of these different routes inside of an API client or a request client, and we'll get just a better sense of how they work and just kind of clarify a couple of loose ends on exactly what the API is doing for us. To make a couple of practice or test requests, I'm going to use an API client called Postman. So I'm going to open up a new tab. I'm going to go to my Chrome installed applications. And I'm going to open up Postman. Now, I already have Postman installed. Again, it is a network request client that we can use to make network requests to arbitrary endpoints. You don't have to install Postman. It's totally optional. I'm going to show it to you just to kind of demonstrate exactly how the API works. If you want to install Postman and follow along, you can open up Chrome and then go to the web store and do a quick search for Postman and download it and install it. Okay, so I'm going to open this thing up and we'll go ahead and make a test request. So we'll wait for the load any minute now. There we go. Okay. So in this interface, we can select the type of request up here. We can enter in the URL that we want to send the request to, and then we can specify some of the different options that are going to accompany the request, and then eventually click send to send the request off. So I want to go through the process of first creating a post, fetching it, and then deleting it. So in total, we're going to make 3 separate requests. Flipping back over to the API documentation, I'll find the second route down here, which is the route that we can use whenever we want to create a new blog post. So I'm going to copy this endpoint right here. I'm going to copy it. I'll flip back over to Postman. I'm going to put it up in the request URL. Because the documentation says that to create a new blog post, I have to make a post type request. I'm going to make sure that I've got post selected here. And then I'm also going to make sure that I specify some body of the request. So you can see that I've already entered in a body here. Now, if you're following along with Postman, some really important settings to make note of. Do make sure that you've selected raw on here, and make sure that you've also selected a post type of JSON, or excuse me, application/JSON. Now in the body of the request, this is not a JavaScript object, it's a JSON object, which has just slightly different semantics. Essentially just make sure that you're using double quotes around all the keys and all the values. If you use single quotes, like so, you're gonna see a little error message pop up. And if you omit the quotes altogether, yeah, it's still gonna be an error as well. So do make sure that you're making use of double quotes everywhere in here. Okay, so when I send this request, it should create the post on the server and then return the newly created post to me. Now, one last thing that I want to mention before I actually send this thing off. Because this API right here, it doesn't really have the concept of unique users or anything like that. So the kind of semantic that we're using for identifying posts that belong to a particular user is to add on a little API key. So this is going to be a parameter that we tack onto the URL. The key is you don't have to generate it ahead of time. You could just enter in a completely random string of characters. The only requirement is that you must provide the key on every follow-up request that you make. So in practice, all I really have to do is add on key and then some unique string that I continue to use to all the time. So for me, I think I'll use Steven1234. That's good enough. Okay, so I'll send this request off. And yep, looks like the post was created. I get back the title, categories, and content of the post, and you'll also notice that I now have an ID assigned to the post as well. So now I can make a follow-up request to my API to fetch this particular post right here, if I so chose. Let's try doing that now. So I'm going to copy the ID. I'm going to change the type of request over to GET. And just to make sure everything's really clear, let's check out the documentation on this as well. If I go down to the third line right here, you'll see that to fetch a very particular post with a given ID, we'll make a GET type request to API/posts/ the ID of the post I want to get. Okay, so I'm going to make sure I go to API/posts/ the API, or excuse me, the ID of the post that I just created. So now I'll make my request, and yep, I get the same request back, or excuse me, I get the same post back. Now the last thing that we can do is make a delete type request with the same exact URL, and that will delete this post. So I'll delete it, and okay, that should pretty much be it. Now if I make a follow-up GET request, I would expect to see an error message saying, hey, you can't find that post. So yep, 404 status, error not found. Okay, so that's the 3 big routes, and of course there's one other big route that we're going to care about, which is the index route. That fetches a list of all the different blog posts that are tied to this particular API key. Now there's one last thing I want to mention about this API that I put together. I put a throttling mechanism around the API so that you can only make a limited number of requests per second. This is just to avoid you accidentally writing a request inside of a for loop or something like that and firing off too many requests. So if you start to make a ton of requests, and we're talking about like 5 in 1 second, you might start to see some requests fail. And again, that's just because I'm making sure that you're not accidentally writing some mistake code here that starts to crash the API or anything like that. In practice, I really don't expect you to run into that limitation at all, so it should definitely be a-okay. Okay, so in this section, we did a big overview of the API that we're going to use. We've got a better idea of how the API is going to work. So let's continue talking about the architecture of our application inside the next section.